Today, we are diving deep into a truly incredible story. It's about love, sure, but it's also about technology, trauma, and a really painful betrayal. We're going to trace this whole journey from a shared past that fractures into these endless digital echoes and see how it all seeks a final, coded resolution. Let's get into it.
And that really brings us to the big question hanging over this whole thing. Can you actually use the language of cybersecurity, of protocols and firewalls, to decode something as messy and human as the heart? Well, this story tries to do exactly that, and it creates this fascinating, kind of wild framework for understanding human connection in our very digital world.
So, to really get how this whole conflict finally lands, we have to go way back, right back to the very beginning. Because this entire story, this whole philosophy, it was literally forged in the fire of an unbelievable personal trauma. This question right here, it's basically the key that unlocks the entire narrative. It's the lens through which one man, Alberto Daniel Hill, tried to make sense of a world that had just completely imploded on him. He took the logic he knew best, technology, and tried to apply it to the absolute chaos of human emotion. Okay, so let's set the stage. The relationship starts in June 2010, and just one single day later, a cactus named Walter comes into the picture. Now, Alberto called Walter an object of low entropy, basically a single point of calm and predictable order that could somehow survive in a hostile world. And for almost 8 years, that cactus, Walter, was the silent witness to their entire story until March 2018, when everything just completely shattered. The event that broke everything? It was both tragic and just brutally ironic. Alberto was arrested and thrown in prison for a computer crime, and the whole thing started because he was trying to help Evely with something so normal, so mundane, booking a doctor's appointment online. And in a detail that is just so absurd it's hard to believe, the police actually confiscated Walter the cactus, as if it were some kind of dangerous evidence. It was a moment that Alberto later called a new Genesis block. In blockchain terms, the very first transaction, the moment that kicked off his entire emotional processing. And right there, in that moment of absolute chaos, this completely radical idea was born. When Evely, just totally overwhelmed, told him she couldn't handle the situation, Alberto didn't see it as a rejection. No, instead he saw it as the ultimate validation. He called it a proof of love. Her honest, unfiltered inability to cope became the protocol itself, the thing that proved just how immense the trauma they were sharing really was. Her withdrawal was the proof. And he made this very abstract idea totally concrete with this brilliant analogy to blockchain. So in crypto, proof of work uses a ton of computational effort to validate a block of data, right? Well, in his proof of love, it's emotional vulnerability that validates a human connection. And the input isn't some math problem, it's shared trauma. It's just a really powerful way to completely reframe what validation can mean.
So, after this trauma, the conflict turned inward, the fight moved inside. Alberto started using his art to process these endless, painful echoes of his past. He began what he called a kind of narrative archaeology to make sense of it all, basically translating his internal war into music.
And to really get what was going on in his head, you have to understand the total scale of his loss. This wasn't just about his freedom. Look at this list from the police seizure. The laptops, the phones, but especially those 13 hard drives. That was a complete erasure of his entire digital identity. They were the physical container for his whole world. So what does he do in response? He creates the song Denial and Desire. And this just perfectly shows his mindset. He called this song his artistic proof of work, all the complex emotional labor he had to do to validate his own recovery. He even described making it as a side channel attack on his own memory, specifically designed to bypass the firewalls of trauma. And the song's structure? It's basically a perfect map of his internal war. This table just breaks it down beautifully. You've got the cold, mechanical Italo disco. That's his attempt at control, his denial. But underneath, the melodic deep house is the constant pulse of his true desire. And then, the organic cello cries out with his internal suffering. And these explosive rock guitar riffs, that's the trauma breaking right through that carefully built facade. It's a sonic battlefield. Even the tempo itself tells a huge part of the story. At 90 beats per minute, it's actually slower than your typical high-energy dance track. And this creates what the source calls a rhythm of inevitability. It's not a frantic escape. It's a slow, measured, and totally unstoppable march toward confronting himself. Okay, so fast forward a few years, and the story takes another massive, dramatic turn. That private philosophy of proof of love collides head-on with a very public act of aggression, and an intimate history gets turned into a weapon. Now, to understand what happens next, we need this key psychological concept, displaced aggression. It's basically when a person can't confront the real source of their frustration, so they redirect all of that anger and rage onto a more accessible and often a much more vulnerable target. And in this case, the source material points out that Evely, who's now referred to as CG10, was under some pretty immense external pressure. She was essentially trapped in a state of profound powerlessness, trying to deal with an unresponsive lawyer for her divorce and a manipulative, abusive ex-husband. These were huge frustrations she just couldn't address head-on.
Okay, now this slide. This is basically the smoking gun of the case study. It compares how CG10 handled her 3 big conflicts. With her lawyer and her ex-husband, she used formal, private, totally contained channels. But with Alberto, she chose a public, recorded forum where boundaries were just profoundly violated. That contrast makes it pretty clear her attack wasn't just a random loss of control, but a deliberate, strategic choice.
The attack itself was like a tactical deconstruction of trust. First, the venue. She chose what Alberto called his digital campfire, a high-trust online space he built with his community on that very principle of proof of love, and she weaponized it. Second, the tactic. She publicly steamrolled his reasonable attempt to de-escalate with that controlling demand, "Call me now." And third, the worst breach of all, she dragged sensitive information about a child into a public forum, causing just irreparable harm. And this quote from the analysis just sums it all up perfectly. The conclusion was that this wasn't just some emotional outburst, it was a calculated act of displaced aggression specifically designed to inflict the maximum possible damage on the most emotionally accessible person she had at that moment. And that brings us to the final chapter. This is the journey from that endless echo to a coded resolution. Because after this public betrayal, the story finds its conclusion. Not in a conversation, but right back where it began, in art. In a final version of that song that tried to process it all. In Denial and Desire, Final Resolution, the lyrics become a direct answer to the betrayal. This line, "You build it up and tear it down. You left the story I made for you." I mean, that's a powerful statement of a completely collapsed foundation. The whole structure of trust was just demolished.
The irony in these lyrics is just staggering. This image of foolish carelessness, of reckless exposure, the angel through the car sunroof. It's the absolute inverse of a hacker, right? A person whose entire identity is built on secrecy and control. It's like a confession of that one moment of vulnerability that led directly to his downfall.
And finally, the song lands on its resolution. It's no longer just an echo of conflict. This declaration, "I will endure," it is a definitive statement of survival. It's a final artistic proof of work, but this time it's not validating a relationship. It's validating his own resilience after all that trauma and public humiliation.
You know, this story, in all its complexity, it leaves us with a question that feels incredibly relevant to all of us. In a world where every single argument, every betrayal can be recorded and replayed forever, creating these endless echoes, how do any of us find a true final resolution? What does it really take to silence the noise and finally just endure?